Hey Flock, I'm Mike from Epic Duck Studios and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be finishing up comic style Gorghadra using a lot of black ink. Specifically, I'm going to be using Daler Rowney FW black acrylic ink. Now to get started, I'm just going to measure out a few drops using the built-in eyedropper onto my wet palette. Now for comic style inking, I like to use a long thin brush. Today specifically, I'm going to be using an Escoda Series 1212 round size 0. So now I'm going to load my brush up with a little bit of ink and just start outlining each of the details. So separating skin from armor and different armor plates from each other, so on like that. Heavy black outlines like this are pretty fundamental to the comic style look because they give the appearance of it having been inked and then colored. Now with details like these edges where it's sort of just a shallow bevel, I'll often just black out the entire surface rather than trying to paint a line at the top of it and then again at the bottom. And what this does is it creates a nice sharp black line on the model, which just helps sell the comic aesthetic. Now I'm taking that totally black surface and just wrapping the black a little bit around onto the outer surface of this shoulder pad now. And the reason for that is so that it has a crisp black line when viewed from above as well, to give the sense of an outline around this detail. The underside of the shoulder pad here I am blacking out entirely because there's no angle where you'll naturally see this on a tabletop. With these inset areas, I'm completely blacking out the overhanging part, so where it's facing downward, but the bottom two surfaces that face upward, I will be just outlining as opposed to blacking. The inside surfaces of each shoulder pad, where they're relatively adjacent to the neck, I'm also just blacking these out entirely because there's not really an angle where you can see them too well on their own. They're really just sort of a adjacent detail to the head, which itself is really saturating detail. So I'm kind of blacking them out so that they just kind of fade away into obscurity, and you see the more important details of the face and the shoulder pads. Because we start with such a bright base coat in comic style painting as well, thick black areas help create a greater sense of depth and make details kind of stand apart from each other. So now I'm just working my way around the face, basically defining all the different details. There's some panel lines in the helmet and so on, areas around the teeth. And I'm just blacking each of those out, just following the natural lines of the model. Now with these overlapping plates on top of the helmet, I make sure to carry the black just a little bit up onto the top surface so that when viewed from the front or from the side, it does have a bit of a black outline, as well as when viewed from the back where this black will be much more prevalent. Now the tail and claws are both made of just a bunch of overlapping metal plates with a bit of a raised edge that I just black out completely. So you can see here I'm just working my way along, basically creating a nice thick black line by blacking out that profile edge. And I'm doing that on both the inside of the claws and the inside of the tail detail. Now this thicker overhanging edge I also black out entirely because you'll only really see it from the bottom of the model, and so I want it to cast a very dark shadow. You'll find that blacking out areas that face downward on the model is very much a recurring theme in my approach to comic style painting. Now I'm going to give the toes the same treatment by outlining each of them and separating them from the rest of the foot. With most of the metal details outlined now, I want to start working on adding shadows and depths to the fleshy bits, and that includes really adding heavy black accents to some of the folds in the skin. So you can see that I'm using the darkest parts of my base coat to help inform where the black will land. And really I'm focusing mostly again towards the bottom of the model so that my highlights just sit at the top, then I work through my base coats, and then the black ink is the deepest shadow. But also I want it to function as an outline, which is part of what makes this look comic bookish. And so there's times where obviously I use it that aren't really a shadow, but just the outline of a detail. So now I'm working into Gorghadra's armpit, and this is a downward facing, really recessed kind of area, so I'm just working a lot of black ink into it, and basically blacking out the entire area. So now I'm going to begin using the black ink to add shadows to the bottom of the claw. And because it's a curved surface that curves away from the horizontal plane, I don't want it to be black all the way across like I have with some of the other smaller surfaces. So I'm going to kind of keep the black focused towards the bottom and pull it out in sort of short strokes towards the edge of the claw, but stopping just a little bit before it with a lot of them. And this is sort of this kind of zigzaggy pattern I'm creating is meant to emulate the look of a brushed steel. So here I'm just revisiting the shoulder pad, adding in some more black edge lining, and I'm going to be bringing a nice curved line along the sort of raised ridge on the center of the shoulder pad where the sort of horizontal and vertical surfaces meet. To help sell the fact that it's a curved surface though, I'm not going to carry it all the way. I'm going to take it about a third of the way from the front and then another third from the back and let it taper off just a little bit, and that'll give it sort of a brighter spot in the middle. So one thing you've probably caught on here is there's really no particular order that I'm inking different details in. You know, I'm working from the shoulder pad onto the tail, onto the helmet, And I'm just sort of bouncing around like that, because I find if I focus too long on any one detail, I get hyper-focused on it, and I kind of maybe take the details too far sometimes. So by bouncing around, I kind of keep the level of detail for the whole model relatively consistent. I just find it works better for my personal workflow. To help give these plates on his spine a sort of comic book chrome kind of feel, I'm going to add some reflected shadows to them. So I'm going to work just some jagged shapes in black ink into the darker parts of the chrome. For me, the inspiration for this look in the metal really comes from like 1990s era X-Men and Spider-Man. So most of the outline inking is done at this point, and I'm going to start bringing out hatch marks, or sort of extending the shadows a little further from where they're just lines out onto the surfaces of the model. So you can see I'm just using a series of parallel lines at a bit of an angle, at about a 45-degree angle, just coming out of where I've already blacked out a darker shadow. And right here where I want it the darkest, I'm actually doing it twice at an opposing 45-degree angle. So I'm getting literally a crossing hatch, or a cross hatch mark as they're called. So I'm just going to continue working my way around the model, pulling out these little small sort of feather lines out of where I've already done either black inking, or in this case on the toes, just from the bottom of the foot. So here I'm working on the first claw again, the one that's being held basically parallel to the ground. And I'm just going to work in more of this dark black, really just leaving it alone towards the outer edges of the claw, so the front of the claw and the back of the claw. And the reason for that is that means that if you see it from a bit of an angle, you'll see a dark, deep shadow underneath it, but it'll be a little bit brighter just towards the edges, and that helps give the illusion of it being sharp as well. Now on the tail here, I'm actually adding the shadow to the top of it, and that doesn't intrinsically make a lot of sense, but on the opposite side of the tail, the brightest point is at the top and the shadow's at the bottom. And those sort of opposite panels like that, moving from light to dark, is a really signature way of making things just appear to have shape in a comic book where you're working on a flat surface. And so because that's my reference point, that's how I'm applying it to the model, even though in a 3D object it doesn't really make sense. Now, this series of strokes right here were literally the most fun I think I've ever had working with ink. I've started referring to this sort of shape that I'm painting as a sound wave, because it really does have that sort of waveform appearance to it. I really like using it, especially on metals, because it gives both the illusion of an environment being reflected, in this case something nearby is casting a dark shadow onto the model, but it also gives the illusion of movement because it's not a static set of highlights and shadows, but it feels very dynamic because it's such a jagged shape. You get the impression that the model is in motion, like he is rampaging and that shoulder is just coming forward. Now here towards the back of the shoulder, I'm trying to mimic part of that Soundwave shape, but I've also brought the highlight really close to the back of the shoulder, so I don't want to have a deep shadow directly adjacent to my highlight. So I'm keeping it very tight and focused on just, you know, the back couple millimeters of the shoulder there. Now I'm going to work my way around all the other gold metallic areas of the model here, just really repeating this Soundwave look wherever I can oppose one of the highlights with it. And again, with the highlights and the shadows, I'm really trying to alternate them on each panel. So you can see on, you know, this left shoulder pad, for example, I've used a highlight at the top and a shadow at the bottom of the left side of it, and then I'm doing the opposite on the right side. But I'm also bringing a little more shadow in right here where it's adjacent to the spine, because the spine itself is already really bright, and so I want a shadow to set it off from that. So right here, I'm just working a very small, jagged black outline across the very edge of the claw. And the reason for that is so it opposes the bright highlight that's above it. You can't really see it from this angle, but there we go. Very quickly, you can see it there for just a moment. The top of the claw is very bright at that point, and so I wanted the darkest point to oppose it, because that really gives the illusion of sharpness. Going directly from a very bright area to a very dark area sort of just accentuates how tight that crease is. Here I'm adding a few little circles and lines, basically to have surface imperfections in the claw here. Basically look like he's bashed into some things and it's got a few little dents in it. Now I'm going to continue working my way around the model, just adding different scratch dents and blemishes, basically in the form of small lines and circles. It's actually a really simple process. This particular little bit of style is really heavily influenced by Borderlands. If you look at any of their surface textures, this is a really common trait. And now, because he's a big gross monster and basically everyone has imperfections in their skin somewhere, I'm going to give him a few blemishes on his skin as well. I'm going to add a few more blemishes here, and then Gorghadra will be done. And here's a full 360-degree rotation of the completed Gorghadra. The only thing I haven't done yet is spray it quickly with a anti-shine varnish. You can see the black ink, especially where it's really heavy on the shoulder pads, is actually quite reflective. And that's just a property of the ink itself, and a very quick blast of anti-shine varnish, such as Army Painter matte varnish, would go a long way to stopping that. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. There's plenty more here on YouTube. You can also join me twice a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios on Thursday and Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern, where I do stream my painting live. If you want to support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Even giving as little as $1 a month helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing. You can also help by hitting subscribe here on YouTube or sharing this video with some friends. Thanks a lot!